Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about Mexico. And of course, let's talk about the Mexican flag. Colors of Mexican flag have any meaning? Yeah. Woo. The green has the a connotation of being representative of the independence movement away from Spain. The purity of the Catholic faith is white, and the idea of blood of national heroes, which we'll look at extensively. The center is Aztec symbolism, and of course, the Aztec capital, apparently an eagle devouring a serpent on a cactus, is the location of the capital, and so that has been brought forward from the Aztec Empire. The geography and population of Mexico. We have the second largest country in Latin America, 114 million people. Its primary ethnic cleavage here is going to be mestizo versus Amerindian. These are just the indigenous populations. You'll see much more of the indigenous in the south, as opposed to mestizo everywhere else in the north. And of course, the mestizo was when the Spanish came and intermingled with the indigenous population. What you got was mestizo. Mexico City is the capital. It is one of the largest cities in the world at 22 million people. Almost 78% of all people in Mexico live around urban areas. Of course, Spanish is the spoken language, and Catholic is the dominant religious faith there. There is a significant split between the indigenous, much poorer south, and the more technical and wealthy north, especially along the border of the United States. So that's also a primary cleavage. Let's start with Mexican independence. You have the story of Miguel Hidalgo, who basically marches against the Spanish with an army of 100,000 followers. He eventually, by the way, gets captured and executed. But if you notice, he's a Catholic priest going up against the mighty Spanish Empire. And it's said that when he went to the gallows, he turned to the soldier that was taken up there and said, "Hey, you've treated me really nice, but just know that I'm going to live on in history, and no one's going to even know who you are tomorrow." So he was quite the person. From 1821 until 1867, there is just a complete, massive amount of chaos going on in Mexico. There are 52 presidents, people that say that they're going to take power. A lot of them end up dying. Some are executed. Significant cleavages, of course, that more liberal reformist versus, well, we're going to stay to the tradition, tried and true conservatives. Should we have a federal society where the regions get some more power, or a centrist society like a unitary? Of course, we have the clerical versus secular in a Catholic state, and in the native versus mestizos. And of course, while this is going on in the 1800s, all the chaos of the United States basically takes, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the whole northern part of Mexico. I thought there was like a whole lot, the Spanish and the Mexicans both pretty much, um, there was missionaries, or people, the criminals were pretty much released in the north. Eventually, Porfirio Diaz, a general, he's very popular when he comes into power. He becomes the stability. This is known as the Porfiriato, the time when he takes over and reigns. He is an authoritarian, and he really connects with the United States, but he makes a really bad judgment call. And this is something that we're going to learn more and more about in terms of Mexico, is that he ignores the rural poor. And you do that in Mexico at your own peril. He kept on, saying, "Oh, we're going to have elections." A lot of Nigeria in this, where he would then just like say, "Ah, not really. We're not going. We don't need elections." Or the opposition would be, you know, discouraged from running, that kind of thing. Eventually, there's a popular revolution in the 19 teens, and he goes to France and runs away. Which, that's what most losers do. They go to France. The Mexican Revolution follows. The Mexican Revolution is over a span of a few decades. Um, Basically, it is, what set of peasants decides who's going to control Mexico, because essentially that's what it's about. If you can control the peasant population in the 1900s, you're going to be able to control Mexico. So you have a group of northern peasants and a group of southern peasants, and the southern peasants are led by Emiliano Zapata. Now, you're not gonna I'm not gonna list a bunch of presidents of Mexico because they were fairly they really didn't matter. What really mattered during the early 1900s was revolutionary leaders and their ideals. So Zapata was a hero of the peasant class. He runs the Zapatista movement. He wanted this idea of redistribution of agrarian land. You could kind of see that he, like almost like a Marxist bend to it. He created a kind of a gang of liberators from the South, particularly in Chiapas in Mexico. Eventually, he is actually assassinated. But presidents basically begged him for his support. He would take his army and he'd march through Mexico City, kind of daring anybody to step up and do away with him. Um, the second one is Pancho Villa. He's out of the north, the hero of the rural north. Politicians were actually terrified of this guy. He would go around towns and get enormous amount of popular support. He is one of the few people that actually invades the United States. He destroys the town of oh, I can't remember. I think it's well, let's go back. Columbus, New Mexico. And the United States Army actually chases him back into Mexico, chases him into Mexico, but they can never find him because he was such a hero and no one was going to give him up. So Villa, Zapata, both very popular revolutionaries. Eventually, the Mexico Revolution does a couple of things. One, wealthy landowners, when this is all done, don't nearly have as much power. Number two, the Catholic Church is kind of diminished. It's seen as part of the state, and people don't like that. Foreign investors, particularly the United States, are limited in what they can actually do. And then there's this understanding that why should we fight? Why don't we consolidate power, the elites, and let's form political parties and actually uh, deal with conflict from bargaining instead of violence, and let's pass on favors to people that give our support. There's your patriot clientelism. And so there's a new constitution that comes about and a new party called the PRI, and they lay the basis for a strong central government. So the president that's kind of seen as bringing the modern state of Mexico forward is Lázaro Cárdenas. He's president in the 30s up until 1940. He mobilizes the peasant class in the South and really becomes attractive to them. Um, he creates the concept of a ejido, which is basically taking land that was primarily used to belong to wealthy rancheros and give it as a piece of communal space to a lot of the people in the South. And so it becomes like a community based item. The land is a part of a community. In some cases, it becomes parks, it becomes farming, it becomes part of a village. But it's very popular as its actual land redistribution to the peasant class. He encouraged workers to form unions and he nationalizes the oil industry. He creates that famous thing, the parastatal in Mexico, what will eventually be known as Pemex. He also engages in import substitution. He starts to tell foreign entities, get out of here, and he begins to really get the domestic industry going. He does a pretty good job of it too. He the beginnings of what is known as the Mexican miracle, as it from basically the 30s into the late 60s. Mexico does pretty well economically. Problem is, of course, it is a corporatist state. So PRI basically ends up running the country as a one-party authoritarian dictatorship up until 2000, from the 1930s into 2000. And so any interest group that wants to deal in Mexico had to go through PRI to get anything done, and they would create these interest groups and these organizations like Pemex, where if you wanted to deal in the oil industry, you basically had to go through them and they were going to do what they thought was best for them or the government in charge in Mexico. So power in Mexico still is really defined by interest groups. Civil society is fairly weak. It is getting a little bit stronger, but the PRI really started this trend of putting out organizations to filter who's going to have access to the government. And remember that pluralism and corporatism, pardon me, in a pluralist society, all these different elements of civil society can go right to government and try to lobby for change. They have direct access. Is it going to be fair? Is it going to be equal? Of course not. But in a corporatist society, you basically take these organizations, labor unions, associations, interest groups, businesses, and you make them a buffer against having the ability to lobby the government. So they end up being the lawmaking, part of government over here. So it's the idea that you do not have direct ability to influence policy. You have to go through these state sanctioned organizations. So going forward, after Cardenas, the successors are less agrarian; they become more industrial. The PRI does a lot of horse trading, allowing ag leaders, union reps to get land and jobs in return for support. Very corrupt. The PRI runs things like I had said from 2000. There isn't a lot of violence in terms of like the drug stuff you hear now because everything the government essentially they understood the drugs were going from Colombia and South America to the United States. They weren't really going to Mexico, and so the PRI worked with the drug lords and made sure that that kept going. That they just passed on through. We weren't going to fight it, and eventually, the PRI maintains a lot of their power through the manipulation of elections, otherwise known as electoral alchemy. They would do things like harass or intimidate voters. They would put polling stations in people's houses or in locations that were very popular with the party. I mean, and the PRI was excellent at doing this. So the first thing they had to do is they had to get rid of that idea that the PRI was always going to win. So they created something called the National Electoral Institute, or the INE. And this is the independent organization that oversees Mexico's elections. And um, if you remember back in the news a couple of years ago, AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, had proposed taking money out of this and defunding some of it, which really a lot of protest ensued because people saw it as a method of trying to rig the election in favor of Morena, and that, by the way, ended up not taking place. So remember, this is an independent agency operating to make sure that the elections are done freely and fairly. Okay. Eventually, as you got into the 1980s, along with a lot of places in the world, the UK had Thatcher, the US had Reagan. Well, uh, two presidents, Madrid and Salinas, well, became more free market oriented. They started to do more trade. Of course, in 1994, the famous North American Free Trade Agreement is passed. Free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The North has this tremendous benefit. The South was furious. They saw what they saw here was an unequal benefit to the country, and then you're going to notice this when you start looking at wealth and GDP. This is in 2010. If you notice, this is GDP per capita, and back during this time, the, um, the different political parties. You don't have Morena in here, but we'll see that coming up. But if you notice, definitely much more wealthy in the north, 11,000. So it's the same GDP per capita almost as China, where you down here in places like Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas being the poorest state in the entire country of Mexico, three $3,500 GDP per capita. Of course, Michoacan, which has a connection to Ukiah here, also a very poor state, one of the top four poor states in all of Mexico. Right after the NAFTA treaty is passed, the Zapatistas in Chiapas basically revolt. And a lot of people thought this was going to be potentially a civil war. And so a lot of many in Chiapas are indigenously Mayan. They see themselves like the past as Mexico became more free market oriented. A lot of people ignored the South. The indigenous, they kind of like whatever. And so indigenous rights, economic poverty, all this mixes together, and then a man named Subcomandante Marcos steps up. He becomes the leader of the Zapatistas, and they hold a small scale rebellion in Chiapas, take over some towns, and there's some fighting, some deaths, and they demanded jobs, land, housing, food. I mean, like this big populist uprising, and it doesn't succeed. Eventually, what Mexico does is essentially secedes some of the presence and land to Chiapas, and it becomes almost a semi-autonomous kind of state. And the Zapatistas still pretty much rule that area. They call themselves kind of a communal, communist style government. Whether or not it works, that's for you to judge. Um, they used to be one of the safer areas of Mexico to go. Now it's gotten more violent. A lot of it has to do with, of course, the cartels wanting to run stuff into Mexico on towards the United States. You also have trafficking of people. That's because that's another immigration thing that we don't talk about a lot, is the immigration from Central America and South America into Mexico. Okay, so let's talk about some political institutions within Mexico, get a little more specific. It is a federal style government. Its system of power is federal. There are 31 states and a federal district. That federal district is Mexico City. There are four primary parties in Mexico. PAN is the conservative pro business party. You'll see them primarily in the north. The PRD is center left. Actually, it's become more radical as of late. It's like the older version of Morena. It's kind of a social liberal party. PRI is the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It is a straight up nationalist Mexico party. They use a lot of patron client relationships, a lot of favoritism in for return for support. And then the Movement for National Regeneration is the newer party. It is Morena, a democratic socialist but socially conservative party, and very much in a populist vein. Who's going to probably vote for these different groups? Small town, less educated, older, and rural. Uh, Poor are going to vote for PRI. Middle class professionals, better educated, a lot of religious are going to go PAN. And the younger, more politically active, um, kind of broad appeal, that's going to be Morena, though Morena has kind of taken a little bit of a hit. All indications are that they're probably going to win the presidency coming up in later in 2024. The president is the central institution in Mexico. That makes sense since you've had a one party authoritarian regime. Sexenio presidents are only allowed to run 1 6-year term, and then they are barred from running for office from now on after that. Okay. Up until the 1990s, it was again electoral alchemy. Usually, the PRI president picked the next PRI candidate, and and that was known as El Dedazo, the concept of like I'll choose you and I choose you and I choose you, and it just goes on and on and on. The modern presidents are more Western educated. They understand the concepts of markets. They have ties to markets. Um, Manuel Lopez Obrador has, kind of gone back in that a little bit, uh, but for the most part, he still understands that the market-driven things still run the economy. Uh, you, Up until the 70s, basically, if you were president, you were seen as above criticism. Um, he can initiate legislation. Of course, Congress is controlled by Morena, so he pretty much gets whatever legislation he wants. He can make some policies by decree, and decrees have the force of law, as we've seen with Russia. He can make different kinds of administrative and bureaucratic regulations. Of course, that's pretty much every president can do that. And he can remove governors with consent of the Senate. That's something that's fairly unusual that he can actually, if the Senate allows him to, remove governors of certain states. Past presidents, Vicente Fox in 2000 with PAN, Felipe Calderon, also PAN, and Enrique Peña Nieto of the PRI. Let's take a look at them briefly. PAN broke the PRI stranglehold in 2000. Mass amounts of pluralism. Vicente Fox was really, really, really super popular, and I mean really, really popular. He dressed in jeans. He was a rancher. He got along extremely well with George Bush. He had something like a 70% approval rating and some hilarious commercials about the 2016 election here in the United States. So take a look at him if you want to see something fun. Felipe Calderon is a different animal. Calderon comes out in 2006. He wins by only 0.56%, very slim margin. He is fairly moderate, but he does two things. Number one, he starts talking about allowing Pemex to privatize and not become a national, and that makes people kind of go, I don't want to do that. But he does the second thing is he actually takes on the drug culture and corruption. And of course, once you and it, him versus the drug cartels was not necessarily the violence that was the problem. It's when he got a cartel member, then the violence between the other ones vying for territory got really, really, really nasty. So you had a lot of people die during his administration, and it was seen as the beginning of the mass amounts of drug violence. Um, Guess who went against him in 2006? Manuel Lopez Obrador. And if you notice, he was part of the PRD, the center left, and he got mainly the South. Um, uh, Calderon got mainly the North, and Obrador actually did not concede this election. And he said, I'm going to go under and make a shadow government in Mexico and run the South anyway. And he never did, but he was, really stirring people up. People were wondering, are we going to have a potential for some political violence? It never really occurred, but he was talking a pretty serious game. Of course, eventually he wins later on. Peña Nieto, the PRI gets a return. He's a very handsome, charming man and has a very beautiful wife. And that really got him elected, as a lot of his charm and charisma. Immediately he gets popped for being accused of corruption. He was insanely unpopular. I think at his low point, he had like a 12% approval rating. A lot of my students were coming back from Mexico saying, yeah, Peña Nieto, my grandparents hate him. Like I don't know if I heard anybody say that they really like him at all. So he had his one little term and he was extremely unpopular. The 2012 voting results, again, so you have Han does not get the North. Now it's the PRI. And then, of course, the South, still that PRD, the more left of center, the poor. Okay. And yeah, you're out of here, Peña Nieto. The current president is AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. His party also controls Congress. He really ran on the economic development in the South, putting like a train from Mexico City across the Yucatan Peninsula, helping the South out. He was big into fighting for corruption or fighting against corruption. A lot of people see him as just as corrupt as everybody else. He has made some moves that are a bit controversial. Um, what has happened during between 2006 2018? Well, this is changes in vote share for Manuel Lopez Obrador versus GDP per capita, and what you'll notice is some of the largest overall, uh, swings were actually in the north, and so there was a real big push in the north, and that eventually got Lopez Obrador elected. Okay, there are two houses in the Mexican Congress: the Senate, which has again a first past the post and proportional hybrid. They used to have the non-reelected, the presidents did, but that ended in 2014. 6-year term. You can run for 2 terms maximum. Chamber of Deputies, the lower house, 500 people, first past the post and proportional. 3-year term and a 4-term maximum in the legislative branch. The judicial is an independent judiciary. The Supreme Court is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They serve 15-year terms. Their power is weak. They do have independent judicial review, but it's pretty weak. And yeah, they're independent from the executive branch, but the executive branch is far more powerful. The media up until the 1980s was basically a sycophant of the PRI. It would hack party ideology and just regurgitate it up to the public. Now, things like social media, blogging, and civilian journalism are very popular. It is the second most dangerous country in the world, not in a state of war, to be a journalist. Number one is Turkey, where you will be jailed for a lot. And number two is going to be Mexico, where you reporting in on drug issues at all, it really you put your life at risk if you do this. A couple other cleavages. One is migration. Of course, you have internal migration where you have people leaving the south and going to the north to work at the maquiladoras, which are it's the factory zone, the special economic zone along the U.S. border. So, and people traveling north will get on the Beast, which is a series of train networks, and work their way north. But you also have the other immigration problem, and that's Central America and South America, Venezuela, coming into Mexico. and not even necessarily going to the United States. And Mexico is not really good with how it treats its immigrants. Does not like, often will look down at people from Guatemala or Honduras or Nicaragua. And so this is like one part of the immigration that is not really talked about, is the immigration problem of people coming to Mexico from other countries. Okay. Um, the drug trade is obviously a cleavage. Most of the drugs going to the United States. Depending on who you talk to, the deaths during Felipe Calderon's time in office were between 65 and 150,000. The government lost a lot of support because of the drug violence. It is still ongoing. Is the U.S. partly to blame? Well, they're the primary consumers of the drugs, so it's kind of hard not to say that the U.S. is hard to blame. A lot of the fentanyl that actually gets made in Mexico, the drugs are the chemicals are transported to Mexico from China, and then fentanyl is just really really easy to make, and it's you don't need like a huge field of poppies anymore. You can really just do it in a garage. It's very dangerous, and but it's also very lucrative. Um, an example of kind of like the government and the history of protests. One that could be on the AP exam, it's been there before, is the Oaxaca protests in 2006. A group of teachers go out and strike for pay and working conditions. The governor, who is part of the PRI, orders the state police to actually open fire on the protesters, and it becomes this huge, like revolted border, like basically a small scale rebellion. The protesters go and fight the state police. The federal troops then come in because the state police have overused their authority to attack the protesters. So you actually have federal troops fighting against the state police. In the state police, of course, is corrupt and held into hawk by the governor. And then the federal troops, once the state police are kind of put down, have to deal with the protesters that are now angry and vengeful and want their pound of flesh for having been shot at and killed. And so you see like protests over time. The Mexico doesn't have a problem being really heavy-handed with protests, and in fact, over history, Mexico City, of course, was the student protests uh, that came out in 1968 during the Olympics, and they just ran them over with tanks and killed a lot of them. There's been mass kidnappings, mass killings. This one in uh, the one, I think it's Iguala, was where the no, maybe it was, nah, I think it was, where a group of teaching candidates were on a bus that somebody said something to the wrong town official, and so, a group of teachers were essentially, the bus was pulled over, they were all kidnapped and killed and doused in acid and buried, and, it was seen as really, really, really brutal, but, that was some again, you protest to the wrong local official and you put your life at risk. One of the current things that is happening is femicide movement. Women are kind of the feeling of machismo happening in Mexico. A lot of it is being protested against by women. Femicide, the act of killing women simply because they are women. It's an ongoing social movement, and it still continues today. 2024 are going to have elections. By all accounts, those elections are going to have Morena to remain in power. That's not guaranteed. One thing that is not being really reported is how many candidates have actually been assassinated. Not national candidates per se, but there have been an extraordinary amount of local politicians that have been assassinated because again, the connections with the wrong cartels and the wrong organizations. So it's a lot of politicians have gone into hiding. A lot of people don't want to be politicians because they're afraid they're going to get killed. This, of course, creates problems of legitimacy within the government, and it's a kind of a never-ending cycle that we see as the corruption and political the dangers of becoming a politician in Mexico. A lot of people think Mexico has the land, labor, and capital to be the next China, with China kind of having been decoupled from the West. Mexico is in perfect shape to trade with the United States, Canada, and South America to become the next economic engine. The question is, how do you deal with the cartels? How do you deal with the corruption? How do you get the government to get on par with being a driver of economic growth and some kind of, being a government that the people can be proud of and look up to as a source of support?